alderman, saloon keeper, and one time he shot a cop. Who was Paddy Baller? Let's find out. Born 1890, died 1977, Matthias Paddy Baller was the third Baller brother to serve as a Chicago alderman, and one of 13 siblings. His brothers Herman J. Baller and John H. Baller had laid the groundwork for his reign, which included most of the years from 1933, when Baller defeated Waller, until 1966. Following the family's saloon-keeping tradition, he also ran the Deluxe Gardens, a drinking establishment at 333 West North Avenue, now the site of a mini-mall, and, after a move in 1952, 403 West North Avenue, a building which is still standing. Looking at photos of Baller, you can understand that old Chicago nickname for a huge beer belly, the Alderman. Baller himself could supposedly down half a gallon of beer in a single gulp. Now, I know what you're thinking. Matthias or Matthias Baller doesn't sound Irish enough for a nickname like Paddy. You'd be right. Baller was German on both sides. But once upon a time, long before Robert Francis O'Rourke ran as Beto in Texas, Irishness, even fake Irishness, was politically useful, especially in a city like Chicago. In fairness, Paddy's firishness seemed pretty sincere. He's quoted as saying, "I've almost forgotten my name is Matthias." He certainly knew where his bread was buttered. Baller spent most of the 30s and 40s backing Mayor Ed Kelly, who led the so-called Kelly-Nash machine with Patrick Nash, chairman of the Cook County Democratic Party. He'd gotten his start in local politics much earlier, as a gun-toting teenage bodyguard for Mayor Carter Harrison Jr. He was later a bodyguard for Mayor Anton Chermak, including during Chermak's 1932 trip to Old Bohemia, in other words, interwar Czechoslovakia, where he was mobbed by bohunks. When Richard J. Daley was first elected mayor in 1955, defeating Hyde Parker Robert Merriam, Baller was ecstatic. He reportedly uttered his most famous boast, "Chicago ain't ready for reform yet," while dancing a jig in his barroom. I say reportedly because the line might have actually been, "Chicago ain't ready for a reform mayor," and he delivered it soon after Daley beat a different, quote, reformer, unquote, incumbent Martin Kennelly. Baller had nicknamed him Fartin' Martin. This was during the earlier Democratic primary. And for what it's worth, the original quotation from the February 24th, 1955 Chicago Daily Tribune reads, "This is victory number one. Chicago isn't ready for reform yet." And Baller was supposedly reacting to the resignation of a Kennelly man, Stephen Hurley, as head of Chicago's Civil Service Commission after Kennelly lost. Now, incidentally, Baller's also quoted as pointing out, "They ain't found it out yet, but Daley's the dog with the big nuts," after this election, because Daley was both mayor and the chair of the Cook County Democratic Party, which gave him an incredible amount of power. Now, this line is not to be confused with the one from former Cook County Commissioner William Beavers, who called himself the hog with the big nuts. Anyway, the point is, local media and other would-be myth-makers, including Paddy himself, are reliably unreliable when it comes to Paddy Baller. He's a convenient archetype, the venal, beer-swilling embodiment of everything wrong with Chicago. The kind of guy New Yorker writer A.G. Liebling could describe as, quote, a superb specimen of a Chicago alderman, unquote, in his funny and outstandingly condescending book, Chicago, the Second City. And you don't have to go all fake news or manufacturing consent to recognize how media coverage can be false or distorted, accidentally or on purpose. Just look at the early history of the Baller family, as recorded in the local papers of the day. As it turns out, Chicago's first aldermanic Baller, Herman J., is a forgotten local legend in his own right. He died young, his rapid rise in the Democratic Party cut short by what some claimed was an assassination. Some of the earliest references to Herman came long before he was first elected to city council. In 1904, he appears to have taken out an ad in a weekly, the Chicago Eagle, with a photo of himself, describing himself as, quote, the well-known insurance broker and Democratic candidate for county commissioner. He didn't win the commissioner race, but for years he kept taking out ads in the Eagle. And in 1910, after he was elected one of the 22nd Ward's 2 aldermen, and while still taking out Eagle ads, he got a coveted character endorsement from them. Quote, Herman J. Baller is pleasant and genial of manner, obliging and faithful to his promises, and therefore popular and respected, unquote. On April 9, 1910, just a week after his last ad, the Eagle describes him as, quote, one of the best aldermen ever in the city council, unquote, hinting at broad support among his friends for a possible run for sheriff. Now, the Eagle's take on Baller differed pretty starkly from the verdict of the Reformist Municipal Voters League, which was recorded in the Tribune. Before Baller's first election in 1909, they mention his, quote, numerous convictions for handbooking and gambling, unquote, at his saloon on Clybourne, concluding, quote, he is an unsafe man for alderman, unquote. Buzzkills. Yet by February of 1911, the Tribune had come around to Herman J. Baller, describing him as a, quote, man of energy, unquote, with a, quote, clear council record, unquote. One of Herman J. Baller's most famous or infamous misadventures, his March 1910 attempt to regulate long ladies' hatpins, which many women apparently saw as an important weapon against the streetcar perverts of that day and age, was also covered rather differently in 2 of Chicago's major papers. Both the Tribune and the Chicago Inter-Ocean, the latter described by the Encyclopedia of Chicago as, quote, an upper-class arbiter of cultural tastes, unquote, covered the long Judiciary Committee meeting where Baller denounced the style, and this is Baller speaking. If women care to wear carrots and roosters on their heads, that is a matter for their own concern. But when it comes to wearing swords, they must be stopped. One man told me he was nearly decapitated in a city hall elevator by the sweep of a hatpin like a scimitar, worn by one of the city hall bells. In the streetcars, people are in danger of losing their eyes by sitting beside some lovely devotee of that fashion. I'll just let you read whatever you want to into that. The Tribune and the Inter-Ocean also both covered actress Nan Davis's defense of the hatpin. And this is Nan Davis speaking. Did I ever have occasion to use a hatpin as a weapon? No, she replied, answering her own question. I never did, and hope I never will have to. Nevertheless, I want to be prepared. Because I have always been prepared may be a reason why I never have been called upon to defend myself. After Baller's speech, another Chicago alderman, our friend and Baller loyalist Anton Chermak, asked Baller if he was married. And here's where the 2 accounts diverge pretty significantly. The Inter-Ocean Times. Are you married? He asked. You bet I am, responded the enemy to the long hatpin. Well then, I'm in favor of it, said Alderman Chermak. This and the wearing of long hats should be tabooed. Last year, he said mournfully, I introduced a bill in the state legislature regulating the size of hats, but it didn't get passed because the legislature adjourned too soon. Chermak was also a member of the Illinois House of Representatives while being alderman. And this is the Tribune's account. Whoa, wait a minute, yelled Alderman Chermak. Say, is Baller married? Not at this writing, replied Alderman McInerney, another gray wolf. So the Tribune does not record a response from Baller, and you can just ponder the implications of the response from McInerney. At his death, Herman J. Baller left behind a widow, Clara, and their 7-year-old son, Walter Baller. So, unless Herman and Clara had their son out of wedlock and got married right before Walter died, it seems like the Tribune is at least guilty of omitting some crucial context. albeit for the sake of a joke. Herman J. Baller also had moments of clear heroism, like the time in February 1910 when he stopped a runaway horse from trampling some children. This is actually the Tribune writing about it. After Baller seized the horse's bridle, quote, "The horse fell on the icy pavement, and Mr. Baller fell with him and was dragged along the ice. While not serious, his injuries were sufficiently painful to keep him away from the council meeting." Of course, this was less than 2 weeks after a police raid led to the discovery of gambling sheets with Baller's name on them. At the time, he claimed it, quote, "must be another Baller," unquote, or the work of one of his enemies, specifically Alderman Bernard F. Klettenberg. One major point of contention was whether or not Baller actually owned an especially notorious gambling joint, Camp Kiowa, or had merely served as its manager. This came to a head in July 1910 with a lawsuit filed by the mother of a man, Paul E. Bine, who was supposedly bankrupted and ruined after 5 years of visiting the establishment. And the Tribune article is a pretty amazing read. Apparently, Baller even bilked this poor guy during a trip to Cincinnati, where the two were at a bowling tournament together. And this is the Tribune. He expressed an intention of playing the Ponies at a local pool room, but Baller insisted that he place any bets he desired to make with him, just as though they were in Camp Kiowa in Chicago. Bine says he placed 8 bets of $25 each accordingly, lost all of them, and was able to return to Chicago only because he had a return ticket. In late November of 1911, Baller was named as a, quote, "vice overlord," unquote, by Ben Hyman, who was testifying to a city civil service commission investigating police-protected vice. Hyman described Baller as a lieutenant of City Oil Inspector James A. Quinn, better known as Hot Stove Jimmy. And just a few days later, Herman J. Baller died. The Daybook, an ad-free paper published by Scripps, records his family's impression that he was accidentally or deliberately poisoned. He'd been drinking that night with a friend, Leo Amrine, before coming home at 1 a.m. and going straight to bed. Just hours later, after repeatedly complaining to his wife of tightness in his side, he passed away. According to his father, the first Matthias Baller, quote, "My son died with foam on his lips. His face became purple a few minutes before death. There seemed to be convulsions of some sort," unquote. Yet, a coroner's inquest named organic heart disease as his cause of death, which is not so implausible given the hard-drinking, physically punishing Baller lifestyle. The Daybook, for example, mentions that Baller had accidentally been shot on a then-recent hunting trip. But at the inquest, one of Baller's friends, John R. Durso, stood up and, quote, "after an exchange with Deputy Coroner M.P. Hartney, shouted, 'Baller was murdered in cold blood. Some of Sullivan's lieutenants put poison in his liquor.'" Sullivan was Roger C. Sullivan, chair of the Cook County Democratic Party and enemy of Baller's benefactor, Mayor Carter Harrison Jr. Of course, in that same Tribune article, Baller's father is quoted as saying, "I have changed my mind about the poisoning." According to the Inter-Ocean, Herman J. Baller's funeral was attended by 10,000 people. A gold star, bought for Baller shortly before he died, was pinned to his clothing. Like Patty, Herman J. Baller is buried at St. Boniface Cemetery on the north side. In early 1912, just months after Herman J. Baller passed away, his brother, John H. Baller, was elected alderman of the 22nd Ward. In 1914, after losing the Democratic primary, much to the delight of the reformers, he managed to win re-election as an independent candidate. This led to the Tribune's subheadline, "Baller Revenged," and his realignment from the Harrison faction to the Sullivan faction, which kind of gives the lie to the assassination rumors, unless the Ballers are inconceivably Machiavellian. He won again in 1916 and in 1918. In 1918, he was billed as a pro-war loyalist, as contrasted with many of those other German Americans who were unpatriotic, perhaps even willing to vote socialist. So maybe this is starting to provide some context for Paddy Baller downplaying his Germanness. Continuing the family tradition, John H. Baller kept taking out ads in the Eagle. Also in keeping with family tradition, he was caught up in numerous scandals. In 1913, after the city's Judiciary Committee voted to raise property taxes, he was one of 4 committee members who had been found not to have filed personal property schedules. In 1916, he nearly got into a fist fight with his opponent, Independent Democrat Victor J. Schaefer. In 1920, despite the Eagles' endorsement, John H. Baller lost the 22nd Ward to Leo C. Klein. And so, for years to come, there were no Ballers in City Hall, at least not in any elected capacity. But what about Paddy Baller? When, where, how, and why did he shoot that cop? It's coming up in our next installment. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed this dive into Chicago history. And enjoy a final thought from real Irish American Daniel Patrick Moynihan. It's not about Chicago, but somehow it seems fitting. New York became the first great city in history to be ruled by men of the people, not as an isolated phenomenon of the Gracchi or the Commune, but as a persisting, established pattern. Almost to this day, the men who have run New York City have talked out of the side of their mouths. The intermittent discovery that New York did have representative government led to periodic reform movements. But the reformers came and went. The party remained.